Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of South Australia. I'm Craig Batty, and I'm the Executive Dean of UniSA Creative. Really thrilled to be welcoming you here tonight to be partnering with the History Trust of South Australia for this third Talking History event for 2023. Another one to come later in the year and more to come next year as well. Really thrilled to be partnering with our friends at the History Trust. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also acknowledge and respect the ongoing cultural, spiritual, physical and emotional connections that the Kaurna people have with their lands, waters and community. So as I mentioned, this is the third of the four Talking History series events for 2023, with more to come next year. I know I've said that twice, but I'm just geeing you up for the future. And I think it's really great that we can meet here in the University of South Australia, in the Bradley Forum, which of course is named after Denise Bradley, the former Vice-Chancellor, who was a very big advocate for education across Australia. Some of you might be aware of the 2008 Bradley Review around the future of higher education, which is really coming into play now with the Universities Accord, which is obviously playing through right now. So there's lots of really energy around kind of education and the not just the importance of education in society, but the idea of people thinking and provoking and prodding. And I know Kiera very well, and she's very good at provoking and prodding and prizing open and all the other P's. So thinking about this through an educational partnership with us is really, really, really great. And especially in UniSA Creative, which, as we know, history can be creative in many ways. So really interested in hearing how that lens might come on tonight's panel. So without further ado, this is where we get out the rings, Kiera. Without further ado, on this special occasion where we're looking at Wonder Women, I would like to introduce tonight's panel chair, Dr. Kiera Lindsey, who is, as you know, the history advocate for South Australia, who herself is a Wonder Woman and does wonderful things. And I'm not going to propose, don't worry, but please give it up for Kiera and the rest of the panel. Thank you, Kiera.
Right back at you, Craig. There's a lot of love in the room tonight. So welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Kiera Lindsey, and I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping stuff that we have to do, and then I'm going to chair tonight's session as well. But of course, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on Kaurna land, the land of the Kaurna people, and their culture has thrived for millennia because it's based upon reciprocal rights and responsibility. Kaurna country is also shaped by the ancestor Chibuki, the great hunter and fire maker, who protected his land by insisting upon honour and respect between all living things. That is, all living things. Kaurna country tells the story of Chibuki's mourning journey as he carried his dead nephew down along the Fleurieu Peninsula into a cave in Rapid Bay, leaving a trail of tears in his wake, which were transformed into fresh water springs. Chibuki Springs in Holdfast Bay still carries his name. May we respect and honour Chibuki's code of conduct, as well as Kaurna culture's culture of reciprocity, tonight, tomorrow, and always. So g'day, everybody, and welcome to you. Typically at this moment, we thank our special guests for coming, those people who are called VIP. Now, there probably are a few VIPs in the room, and I acknowledge them duly, but I think of all of you as VIPs, and really tonight is like a big conversation in a living room or around the kitchen table. I think everybody's got something to say because everybody knows a woman or might happen to be one. So let's acknowledge that we all have a little bit of expertise in this space and hopefully have a rip-roaring conversation. In the unlikely event of an emergency, I feel like a flight person now, please follow the directions of your security guard. The bathrooms are available in the foyer, out the doors and along the corridor to the left. Mobiles, can you please turn those on silent if you haven't already? Just to let you know also that this event is being recorded because it will be aired on Channel 44 in the coming weeks. So you'll get to hear it all again and think about it in different ways. So our Revitalised Talking History series, it's been around for 10 years, this series, and some of you may know its previous expressions, but what we wanted to do with it is bring together panels of history enthusiasts and experts to talk about emerging and exciting questions regarding how we make history in the 21st century. So we choose our panellists around people who are going to bring you a variety of perspectives and possibilities. I'll pick that up in a minute. And in fact, I think we have a real treat tonight. So I suspect, I've got this feeling that we might actually make this event, this topic of talking about South Australian women, a bit of an ongoing event. We might do it at every Talking History. So can I just get a feeling of the mood in the room? A big hands up and a oi, oi, oi for those who think that's a cracking idea. Awesome, I do too. There's just so many fabulous women to talk about, and tonight we get to hear from another 4 fabulous women, but there's so much more. Now this year we organised the theme of Wonder Women according to the History Festival theme, which many of you will recall was Wonder. But next year, in 2024, the theme of the History Festival is dum da da dum 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 power. So we get to talk about power women. So start thinking about your powerful women, women who played with power, people who had power, people who felt themselves powerless until they did otherwise. People who worked in power. I don't know. You think about it. Come to me with ideas. I'll be convening the series, so you can contact me at the History Trust. And we really want to hear the stories of women that perhaps otherwise might be silenced or shadowy in the historical sources. And in fact, that is the reason that we convene tonight. I have skin in this game, as well as being the history avocado, as my husband insists on calling me to make sure I don't take myself too seriously. As well as that, I'm a 19th century historian, a colonial historian, and particularly I'm committed to writing women's stories. And in that capacity, I've recently had an Australian Research Council grant, which is dedicated to historical craft and speculative biography, because I wanted to see if there is a way that we might ethically write about women that captures their spirit, that perhaps recognises the fact that women are often so typically underrepresented in the sources that we need to inform our imaginations and use different techniques to get those stories out of the silence, out of the shadows. In other words, is there a way of writing women where the ends justify the means? I.e., if we can stop the past being distorted by only peopled by white men, then perhaps the techniques that we use might be worthwhile. And if those women were outrageous, badly behaved and defiant, perhaps our techniques need to capture some of that spirit as well. So those were the things that I was interested in my DECRA and in my book that's coming out soon. Yes, shameless plug. But the 4 women that we have here today talking about their women have also been exploring these issues in ways that I hope that you will find inspiring and as interesting as I do. Okay, now before we begin, I just want to make one final acknowledgement, and that is for our guardian angel tonight. Ostensibly, she was created by the polygamous Harry G. Peters, his wife Elizabeth, and their life partner Olive Byrne in the 1940s. She was the founding member of the so-called Social Justice League, and hearkened from the island of Themyscira. Among her arsenal of magical weapons was a lasso of truth, a pair of indestructible bracelets, and a tiara that she could use as a projectile. She was envisaged as one who could triumph by using firepower rather than fists. In episode 8 of the All-Star comic series, when she first appeared, the narrator wrote this about our mysterious guardian angel. At last, in a world torn by hatred and war of men, appears a woman to whom the problems and feats of men are mere child play. A woman whose identity is known to none, but whose sensational feats are outstanding in a fast-moving world. She serves as a symbol of integrity and humanity, so that the world of men would know what it means to be an Amazon. With 100 times the agility and the strength of our best male athletes, strongest wrestlers, she appears to avenge an injustice or right a wrong. As lovely as Aphrodite, as wise as Athena, with the speed of Mercury and the strength of Hercules, she is Wonder Woman. And so tonight we're going to talk and find out more about other Wonder Women. South Australia has, of course, been home to so many weird and wonderful women, many of whom I suspect you know yourself. Some have left a legacy in law and literature, while others made themselves infamous thanks to love and lawlessness. Tonight we're going to hear about some of them. We're going to have 4 speakers. I'm going to introduce each one. They're going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then after they're finished, we'll have Q&A for 10 minutes. So get your questions ready, and we'll talk at the end. Our first speaker is the fabulous Lainie Anderson, who many of you in South Australia will know as a columnist for Adelaide's Sunday Mail since 2007. She has 35 years of journalism and public relations career, and including stints on the Melbourne's Herald Sun, London Time, and South Australian Tourism Commission. In 2016, Lainie was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to gauge the international significance of the 1919 air race from England to Australia and the Vickers Vimy aircraft that is now housed at Adelaide Airport. It's such a beautiful exhibition. If you haven't seen it, go and see it, please. Lainie's debut novel, Long Flight Home, was published in Australia and the UK, and she also co-produced a 1-hour documentary on the air race, which was presented by the astronaut Andy Thomas and premiered on SBS. Lainie is currently studying a PhD with UniS Creative and exploring the life of the person we're going to hear about today. I'm not even going to mention their name because it's a surprise. So Lainie is also an ambassador with the Hutt Street Centre and sits on the SA Regional Selection Committee for the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. And finally, if she's not already doing enough, for goodness sakes, Lainie is also a historian guardian for the South Australian History Trust, and earlier this year was announced as the emerging historian by the History Council of South Australia. Please make the fabulous Lainie very welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So great to see so many Wonder Women in the audience. I mean, it just looks like a sea of women from up here, which is fabulous. And, you know, a lovely supporting cast of blokes as well, which is how we like it. So, I'd first like to join Craig and Kiera in acknowledging the Kaurna people on whose land we meet tonight and pay my respects to the elders who have been guiding the way since the first sunrise. And thank you also to Kiera for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And that works. That makes me happy. Okay, so often when I'm in front of a crowd like this, I'll mention the name Kate Cox, and most people will think of the Mothers and Babies home that she founded in Brighton and was named posthumously in her honour after her death in 1954. Less is known about Cox's pioneering role as a policewoman, which is the focus of my PhD and my presentation tonight. So, as you probably read earlier, I first heard about Fanny Kate Boadicea Cox back in 2020 in a tweet by Mr. South Australia, Keith Conlon. And how could I refuse a woman named like that for my next protagonist? In 1915, unmarried and 40 years of age, Cox was handpicked to become the first policewoman in the British Empire, employed on the same salary as men and with the same powers of arrest. She smashed drug rings and arrested clairvoyants, preying on the grieving wives and mothers of soldiers during World War I. But most of the time she just walked the beat, rescuing women from men, from abusive husbands, and from themselves, whether they liked it or not. Mothers in distress were given to cry, "Call Miss Cox," at the first sign of overt friskiness in their daughters. Indeed, the archive shows that in her own era, her work was so celebrated that she influenced the development of women police units across Australia and overseas. At the outset, Cox was asked if she wanted 6 additional women police constables, and she said, "No, give me 1. I don't even know what I'm going to do yet." In 1916-17, the number of women on her team grew from 2 to 5, and take a look at the sheer amount of work and legwork. like meeting over 1,000 trains and steamers to make sure that any unaccompanied women and children were accompanied to where they needed to be, or given money if they needed to get to where they needed to be. Those miscellaneous inquiries included everything from alleged white slave traffic and neglected children to the ill treatment of wives by their husbands and raiding houses of ill repute. In the 20 years that Cox was at the helm of the Women Police Branch, South Australia's female population grew 32%, and yet the number of women convicted of an offence stayed almost exactly the same. Actually, it dropped by 3. Cox was a strong believer in the second chance. A third chance, absolutely not. And she diverted, it was her stated aim to divert women from the criminal justice system. Analysis of 20 annual reports that Cox wrote for the Police Commissioner suggests some 75,000 women and children came into contact with her branch, and that doesn't include all the trains her women constables met or their nightly patrols. When she retired, Cox had a 14 women team. The nearest Australian state was New South Wales with 7. The Police Commissioner, Brigadier General Lainie, described her as the biggest woman I've ever met. She was 5'6", who'd used some of the most unorthodox policing methods I've ever seen. Born in Moonta to Cornish parents in 1875, Cox was a strict Methodist and teetotaler, but she also loved a perm and used the best tailors. She was emotionally intelligent, yet mostly aloof. She often recited hymns to anyone who would listen and disdained what she called moral weakness, yet she had a wry sense of humour. She was known to give away all of her salary one week and spend all of her money on a single hat the next. To some, she was everybody's friend. To others, she was known by her derisory nickname, 3 feet apart. So how do I tell this woman's story? One of the first steps of a PhD is a literature review, and in the existing literature, I got a hint of why Kate Cox might have been all but lost to history. In 3 short biographies, amidst fairly scant resources all round about her actual private life, she'd been largely stereotyped as a one-dimensional saint-like figure. My aim was to paint her in shades of grey as the complex product of her time that she really was. I wanted to bring this early 20th century woman back to life in a way that endeared her to 21st century readers, or at the very least made her interesting. And so the central question of my PhD question is this, or my PhD project is, could a popular historical murder mystery tell Kate Cox's story in a way that does justice to her as a complex and significant figure in South Australian history? That's right, I decided to make Cox the protagonist in a fictional murder mystery. Having researched her work, I knew that my main narrative arc would need to be fiction. None of her real cases would sustain an entire novel and all the plot points needed along the way. Anyone who's read, like me, the #1 ladies detective agency will know that Alexander McCall Smith's wonderful protagonist, Precious Ramotswe, solves smaller cases within the main mystery narrative. And that's how I decided to represent the facts about Kate Cox, not through the actual overarching murder mystery, but through her hero's journey. One of my supervisors, Ben Stubbs, suggested a meticulous chapter outline might be the key. And so I came up with that. That's my mind at work. Actually, yeah, that's my mind right now. These initial scribbles became a 2-page chapter outline. Brief individual chapters and scenes focus on how Cox once made a domestic abusing husband kneel on the floor and recite the Lord's Prayer to repent. True story. How she successfully argued a woman in danger of being arrested for public drunkenness was suffering a stomach bug. How she used her acute powers of observation to catch shoplifters. How she'd put her hands to the wall of the closest church for divine inspiration from God and believed it helped her to solve cases. There's a chapter inspired by the women learning jiu-jitsu, which I did, and another on how their early evidence was thrown out of court as hearsay because they were given no formal training in the law. Bearing in mind this process has never been as simple as writing a murder mystery. Every word aims to do Cox justice. Borrowing from the likes of Margaret Atwood in Alias Grace and Hannah Kent in Burial Rites, my guiding principles were these. Where there were established facts, I stuck to them. Where the facts were hazy, I used broader context and wider truths from the Cox archive and literature, scarce as it was. Where the facts ended, I turned to plausible invention while always avoiding gratuitousness, which of course would not do her or myself justice. So here are some examples. In the 1960s, as part of a short biography, Methodist Reverend George Shapley wrote how Cox was fastidious about her appearance. She loved a perm and a face massage. She was known to linger at counters. Take a look at Victoria Square here. Okay, so I don't think that's going to work. Maybe on that one. No. Oh, yeah, there. Oh, it's going on the back, but it's not going. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, here's Landrowner Terrace. That's where, just about right there, is where the Women Police Branch was. Here's the police court, nowadays the Magistrates Court. Here's the centre of Victoria Square. And right here is where Moores on the Square opened a year after the Women Police Branch opened. So knowing how much Kate loved her shopping, that's where we meet her through the eyes of shop assistant Ruby Campbell in lady shoes. With a jolt, Ruby saw one of her best customers striding towards her with fixed determination. "Lord," she muttered, stepping back to quickly straighten her dress, "that woman loves to shop." That woman was Miss Cox, officer in charge of South Australia's Women Police. She was born Fanny Kate Boadicea Cox. Her family called her Katie and close colleagues called her Kate. By January 1917, most of Adelaide called her Miss Cox. And as for the others, well, the insults were like water off a duck's back. Here's another less glowing example. In 1988, Leslie Unwin told Adelaide historian Patricia Summerling how Cox did her nightly patrols with a 5-foot cane. She'd put this cane between your legs and the girls' legs and she'd say, 3 feet apart, 3 feet apart. And it's Kate Cox, trying to pull everything up and dress yourself. And she's whacking you in the bottom and she's really cutting you up. And you'd be running down the field and the Sheila would be running the other way. That became a self-contained chapter on Cox encountering a young couple during one of her patrols. Another crucial element of doing Cox justice was ensuring her 20th century views could be aired without 20th century judgment. And so we have her fictional sidekick, Ethel Bromley. This is an anonymous person who I found in a picture in the State Library around exactly the same time. And I just love Ethel. She provides the yin to Miss Cox's yang. Through dialogue with the intensely loyal Ethel, we learn Cox's conservative views on things like birth control, abortion, and institutionalising young girls she believed were a danger to themselves. Where there were significant gaps in the archive, including 10 years from when Cox was about 15 to 25, I leaned on speculative biography techniques used by the likes of our very talented and gorgeous history advocate, or avocado, Kiera Lindsey, drawing on known facts and wider historical truths to plausibly invent what might have been. Because I was writing fiction and because a mystery can't have footnotes, I'm choosing to call it plausible invention as opposed to speculation or anything. I just want to be really clear that it's fiction and I'm inventing. We know, for example, that around the age of 14, Cox went to live with Victorian relatives. Here she assisted with family chores and continued her education. We know that Cox's father Anthony and brother Arthur went interstate to work in the mines at the same time to pay off massive debts the family racked up on a ruinous farm in Quorn. We know Cox's mother Elizabeth returned to work as a provisional teacher with youngest child Frank in tow. With the family scattered across Australia to regain their fortune, I deemed it plausible that Kate was sent to Victoria for a similar purpose, to work in service for relatives who had loaned her father money. This didn't just fill a hole in the narrative, it became central to who Cox was and why. Here we have Cox's mother Elizabeth remembering the past. Elizabeth had no choice. She was too broken to take care of Katie with her unrelenting, fierce will, and the family was too ruined to stay together. Anthony left to search for work in mines across the border, and later Arthur followed. Elizabeth got herself strong before securing another teaching job in another town 60 miles north of Adelaide, taking Frank with her. She'd never forget the scarlet-faced rage of 14-year-old Katie, who left on the train for Ballarat, and she'd never forgive herself for the change in the young woman who returned 6 years later. Bible in hand, head held high, emotions deeply buried. Quite well was all Katie ever offered when asked how she'd enjoyed her time in Victoria. Then she'd press her lips together and open her eyes wide in a way that made Elizabeth wonder if her daughter wasn't still screaming at the wind inside. Another plausible invention was a fleeting romance in Cox's backstory. Again, it is based on what I found during research, that Cox worked as a 25-year-old teacher in Thomas Plain on York Peninsula, that she once told her niece she'd been in love, that she told a newspaper reporter later in life that her dream of marrying a farmer had ended when she decided her work was more important. This inspired a brief past encounter when she was a young teacher in my manuscript. Patrick, dear Patrick, her farmer from Thomas Plain. From their first meeting at church, he'd adored her, believed her appointment as a provisional teacher in his tiny South Australian town was divine deliverance. She was 25 then, and for a brief time, she thought she could love him too, let herself believe that life had led her to this man and this place. These plausible inventions help us to connect with Cox on an emotional and I hope enduring level. Throughout the process of writing the manuscript and working through several redrafts with my supervisors and now with literary agent Melanie Ostel, a few fundamental themes and lessons have emerged. The first is that I feel a responsibility to champion all women of World War I Adelaide after learning from numerous scholars that my entire gender was written out of the Anzac legend and therefore our national identity. I've also become acutely aware of the need to remain aware of family sensitivities, and one of Cox's descendants, Liz Hilson, has been a wonderful source of inspiration and encouragement. One learning that's not up there, and probably the most important actually, is don't write anything that you can't defend when you're dealing with a woman with a complex legacy like Kate Cox. Also importantly, I've learnt that as the fiction expands, the facts needn't change. You just need to get more clever in the writing. Less exposition, more dialogue and personal introspection from multiple points of view. For example, my initial 250-word, very, very dull narrator's exposition on how Colonel William Light designed Adelaide is now told from Kate Cox's point of view as she strides down King William Street. But for his extramarital nonsense, the city's designer, Colonel William Light, might have been someone she championed. She admired the city for its grid design and its ring of bird-filled parklands, and only wished the human condition could be so neatly arranged. As I near the end of my PhD, submission date November 7, and with 11 publishers currently reading my manuscript, I realise that what I've actually been doing all along is hiding the facts in plain sight. My great hope is that this fictional project will allow Kate Cox to be seen in all of her humanity and in the context of her time. I hope it will demonstrate that a work of fiction, a work of empathy, emotion and plausible invention can not only do her justice, but allow this complex South Australian to walk the beat in Adelaide again. Thank you.
Wow, I'm a bit scared of her. I am full of admiration and affection for you, Lainie, but I wonder if she is walking the beat, if she's still carrying her, what is it?
She would be.
Yeah, rightio. Fantastic. So we'll have an opportunity to talk with Lainie a little bit more about her techniques and some of those wonderful questions that she's raised also about plausible invention and how you work with keeping the facts in plain sight. Next, we're going to shift from law to lawlessness by inviting Leeza Peters to speak to us next. Leeza was actually just 12 years old when her father, Alan Peter, author of No Moment of Stone and Dead Woman Walking, introduced her to Elizabeth Woolcock's story and to the whole family. In fact, Leeza was telling me just before that she was actually typing up the manuscript for her father and became really fascinated by that story. Isn't that beautiful? Since then, Leeza has worked tirelessly alongside her dad for over 40 years, researching the history of this case and pursuing a posthumous pardon for Elizabeth, sorry. She strongly believes that Elizabeth was a victim of a biased legal system, an obstinate government, and was hanged an innocent woman. Leeza's passion has led her to write, direct and produce 2 stage productions, 5 short films, a manuscript and television scripts, and to create a sculptural monument to honour Elizabeth. We're not obsessing about Elizabeth, however. I bet you there's not much time. Leeza is a community development officer with the city of Onkaparinga, and in her spare time, she creates artwork locally, interstate and overseas. Please welcome Leeza.
Thank you, Kiera. Thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be here tonight. Please bear with me, as Kiera just mentioned. I have about 40 years of research to cram into 15 minutes, okay? So Elizabeth was executed 30th of December 1873. That's 150 years ago this year. My dad was born and raised in Moonta, and he heard about the story from his nana, who lived just down the road from the Woolcock cottage. He went to research his family tree, found the story again, and thought this was so much more interesting. So I was about 12 years old when he wanted a manuscript typed. So myself, my sister and my mum were typing the manuscript on a manual typewriter. It was that long ago. He wrote the first book, No Monument of Stone, and then subsequently Dead Woman Walking. Through our research, Dad and I believe she was hanged, an innocent woman. Anyway, I'll tell you why. So she was born Elizabeth Lillian Oliver. She was born in Burra on the 20th of April, 1848, to John and Elizabeth Oliver. They were living in a little dugout, similar to what you'll see on the screen there. It was called a little dugout. It was lots of families lived in those. The downside of that was the flood came through and washed everything away. So, like a lot of families back then, they were driven to Ballarat in search for gold. The age of 4, in the goldfields, her mother abandoned her. Her mother wanted to leave Ballarat. She couldn't stand it anymore, and John wouldn't leave. So she abandoned her husband and her daughter. Now, the goldfields was not a place for a family. They were living in a little tent on the goldfields. At the age of 7, she was raped and attacked by an Indian miner called George Shawshaw. It was such an awful attack that he was actually, they wanted to execute him, but the law back then just changed and all he got was 15 years. She could not bear children. At the age of 16, she heard her mother was alive and she begged for forgiveness and asked her if she'd like to move in with her and her new stepfather. In her own words, she said, "I wanted to have a home like other girls my age. So I gave up my situation." She actually became a Sunday school teacher at the Wesleyan Church. There she actually had a good life for a few years. She actually found there was a little boy called Tommy. Tommy's father was Thomas Woolcock. He was recently widowed. His wife died of gastric fever only a year earlier. Another little son died 6 months later. So Elizabeth took sympathy. So she thought she'd clean house for Thomas. Her stepfather heard about this, and he was furious. He threatened to cripple her if she continued to work for him. She was really upset. She couldn't see she was doing anything wrong. He threatened to cripple her if she went over there. Thomas then said, well, let's get married. She was beside herself. She didn't know what to do. She married him the next Sunday morning. So the stepfather could not stand it any longer. He was angry. They left. Her and the stepfather and mother moved to Melbourne. She found out what sort of a husband he really was. He was financially burdening her, and he was fond of drink, and he abused her. So she tried to leave, but because she didn't have enough money, she couldn't get very far. So he kept fetching her home again. She tried to commit suicide. She even said, I tried to kill myself several different ways, but I did not succeed. So they took in a boarder called Tom Pascoe. He was a farmer, and life was good for a little while, again until one day. And that was, Thomas thought he'd left the gate open and let the horse out. They had a fight, a huge fight. He told Pascoe not to leave the house and never return. Really interesting, because the next thing, the dog dies. Thomas said it was Pascoe. He went to Sergeant Bentley and said, if this man was to kill my dog, he's sure as hell going to kill me. So he said, look out for a man called Pascoe trying to seek poison. So Thomas came home ill in July. He actually was being treated by doctors. Firstly, there was Dr. Bull. Dr. Bull prescribed these pills, these pedophyllin pills, and they had a grain of mercury in. He took the tablets, and in fact he said to one of his work colleagues, this is making my teeth sore, and it's making me vomit. His own colleague said, go for another doctor. They went to Dr. Dickey. Dr. Dickey actually said, you've got gastric fever. He treated for gastric fever. And he didn't return. So then they got the third doctor, Dr. Herbert. Now, Dr. Herbert actually took one look at Thomas and said, who's been giving you mercury to the point it is poisoning you? So Dr. Herbert treated for mercury poisoning. So with the mercury poisoning, he treated for 13 days. And on day 13, he was feeling much better. He was up and eating. He was fine. But he actually turned to Dr. Herbert and said, I can't afford your fees. The other two doctors were mining doctors. They gave free service. The third paid. So Dr. Herbert treated him. So then Dr. Dickey came back on the scene. Dr. Dickey said, I'm still going to treat you for gastric fever. He did. He continued to treat him until he died. So he was about to sign the death certificate when Thomas's own cousin, Beth Snell, came up and said, I think there needs an investigation. I've seen and heard that Elizabeth has been going around town getting poison and that she's been hanging around with Pascoe. So an inquest was held. 14 men and a JP came to the Woolcock cottage and interrogated Elizabeth. It was there that Dr. Herbert said, I was treating him for mercury poisoning. So they held a post-mortem. They took Woolcock's body, put him on the table and cut into him. It was there that they thought it needed further investigation. So Elizabeth was taken into custody, put on trial at Moonta, in the Moonta courthouse. This was where she got to say one thing: I did not kill him. It would be of no benefit to me, because everything I have was left to his son. So it was taken to the Supreme Court. Here she pleaded not guilty. She was given a lawyer who took the case free of charge, but he'd only been in Adelaide less than a year, and he took on the case free of charge. He'd only dealt with property disputes and petty theft. So Richard Bullock Andrews was the QC, the prosecution. He called on 32 witnesses, and he wanted to convince the jury that she slowly and deliberately poisoned her husband. He actually said that she killed the dog, poisoned the dog as an example of how to poison him. Sorry. And anyway, so then the chemist claimed that Elizabeth or her stepson came into the stores seeking poisons. The witnesses continued to say, yes, I saw her purchasing poisons. And after about 20 minutes, the jury deliberated and said she's guilty. They did ask for mercy on account of her youth. She was 25 years old. So Justice William Waring handed down the death sentence, and then it goes to the prerogative of mercy. So those fine gentlemen, before they meet to talk about the prerogative of mercy, the governor actually received a letter from an analytical chemist, a metals specialist. He wrote to the Attorney General saying 26 reasons why she should not be executed. They responded by sending Dr. Edward Willis Way to respond to that letter. They met on the 19th of December, the four gentlemen, the Governor, Premier, Attorney General and Treasurer. They voted 3-1 to still execute. Governor Musgrave was known for not wanting to shake confidence in the justice system. People believed that they wanted to use her as an example. Elizabeth was hanged. She wrote a final statement before she was executed. It was published in the newspaper the next morning. So if we analyse the case, Dad and I have gone through all of these newspapers step by step and analysed all of this, and what we found was some really interesting things. Elizabeth did not request or purchase any of the white precipitate powders. She was actually after morphine. But the chemist actually said that the morphine was actually poison. She actually received only few grains of morphine, a little bit of laudanum, and oxalic acid, which was for a stain on her skirt. The chemists stated they did not give Elizabeth or her stepson the drugs. In fact, one of them even took the note that the boy had and threw it in the bin. The analyst who examined the body from Adelaide, he said that there was an excessive amount of mercury in the body. He never states how much. Witnesses claim they saw her treating Thomas with mercury, with some poison. That might have been so, but it was actually during the time Dr. Dickey was treating him. So that would be after Dr. Herbert had treated him. Dr. Bull prescribed pills that contained mercury. During the trial, he said, I took the medication away. Then under cross-examination, he said, actually, I coloured them and I gave them back to my patient because he needed it. He said he did it to humour him. So beyond reasonable doubt, William I said it is important to understand the exact amount of mercury to actually answer the question if it's in excess. And there was no lead found in the body, even though Dr. Dickey treated with lead. And no one could have seen Elizabeth give her husband anything during the time prior to Dr. Herbert's treatment. There's no proof she purchased any poison. There were actually no bed sores on the body. She actually cared for him. And Dr. Dickey, this is an interesting one, was actually treating Dr. Bull for a drug addiction. Dr. Bull actually went to the Adelaide Lunatic Asylum, which is a place where drug addicts go. He took his own life in May. That's 5 months after Elizabeth was executed. So beyond her tragic childhood, Elizabeth Woolcock was a victim of domestic violence, malicious gossip, that's what got her there, negligence of the doctors, the biased legal system, using her as an example, the obstinate government, and paid the price with her life for a crime we believe she did not commit. She's the only woman hanged in the Adelaide jail. She never had a voice, and I'm here tonight hoping she's got a voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Leeza. For those of you who would like to know more about Elizabeth's story, I recommend you go to the Adelaide jail. It's really just such a moving place to go to. And there you'll find more evidence of Leeza and her father's research in the form of a walking trail. So really, really beautiful work. And in fact, that project was, as I understand it, was done with UniSA students as well. So here's to collaborations and bringing out uncomfortable, difficult stories, and from those who have been silenced otherwise. Well, let's turn now from law, lawlessness, and now to literature. Our last speaker is, our third speaker is Professor Margaret Allen, the wonderful Margaret Allen, who has been researching women's history in Australia for decades. She said many years, very humbly here. She's researched and published on a number of women writers, including the Scottish-born South Australian poet and novelist Catherine Martin, Nee Mackay, who we're going to hear about tonight. Margaret is a Professor Emerita in Gender Studies at the University of Adelaide, and she is also a dearly loved elder in our history community. Please welcome her tonight.
Thank you very much for the very kind and generous welcome. You might be called an avocado. When I became an Emirate, whatever it is, professor, my daughters referred to, the Emirates Airlines. So, okay. And also, I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on Gauna land, and to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging, but also to say that I'll be talking about the Boandic land, the land of the Boandic in the southeast of South Australia, around Mount Gambier and Narracourt. Probably refer very briefly to the northwest of Western Australia, but I've forgotten the name of the people there, so please forgive me. Now, the talk is called The Most Shadowy Figure in Australian Literature, Searching for Catherine Martin, 1847 to 1937. So rather than, I'm probably going to do speculation, try to explain, where I got to with this work, which I might say my first publication was in 1986, so some of you may not have been born then. And I haven't published on her for some time, but I've written quite a lot about her. I just want to give you the bare bones of her life. She was born Mackay in the island of Skye, and she came to South Australia as a child in 1855. She was about 8. Her family were described as crofters. They were really the refugees of the day. The capitalist sheep farmers brought the land and threw out the crofters who were crowding the land, scarcely eking out a living. They helped finance philanthropic, the lords, the landlords, philanthropic societies, which would get the crofters off their hands. But once the crofters got to Australia and New Zealand, whatever, they had to repay the fare. For the Mackay family arrived here with a debt of £58. Now, this was quite a large family, and I didn't count up all the children again tonight, but some of them were already young men, 18, 19, and she was one of the younger. I think that her brother Alec was younger than her. They had to, so they were very much wanted in South Australia because there were a lot of labourers, you know. You've got one mother, one father who could look after them, and then all these children, some of them are already able to work. And they were sent to live on a run at Narracourt on the station of a fellow Scot, Robert Lawson, who was very, very successful, and they were hut keepers. So they were set far out on the land, on Bowen Dick land near Narracourt. Of course, it was terribly hot, and it was very, very different from the close-knit family and kin and clans around the Lochs and on the Isle of Skye. Not surprisingly, the father died in 1856 on New Year's Day, so within about 6 months of their arrival. And the family sought to support themselves and advance themselves and, of course, pay the debt. Gradually, of course, the older boys particularly were in work, and these brothers took their opportunities. They made them. They were determined to get on. Indeed, they were ruthless on the make. Of course they were. And there was all this Aboriginal land and opportunity to benefit from it. In fact, I found they were charged once with running their cattle or their sheep on, you know, the verge on the edge of the road. So they were trying to get something for nothing, and probably a few sheep, other people's sheep, just happened to get into their flock. They were working as overseers, fencers and things like that. Gradually, the sisters, I think some of them, I'm not sure what work they're doing, but they were educated by their mother. One of them got married quite young, and the young brother Alec went to school. In 1868, Catherine, aged 19, with her sister Mary and mother, moved to Mount Gambier and began a ladies' school in Elm Cottage in Crouch Street, Mount Gambier. They had little boys, of course, mostly young women, girls and women, and some of them were boarders. And Catherine taught and Mary taught, while the mother did some domesticity and ensured that there was respectability. Marjorie Theobald has written of the lost ladies' schools of colonial Australia before the state system. They got subsidies for some of the students, but they could also charge extra for boarders. And for the extras that they taught at this little school were German music, cuttlefish work, and wax flowers. I think cuttlefish work, you got the cuttlefish sort of bone and you carved it in some way. These were enterprises where women could be at home and therefore respectable, but also running a business to support themselves. But while she was in Mount Gambier, and perhaps even just before she came, Catherine Martin starts publishing in the local press, the Border Watch, still a local newspaper. In the press, verse, stories. Lots of women did this, of course, in 19th century South Australia, or Australia. Some of it, what they wrote was doggerel, terrible stuff. But many important Australian women novelists like Tasma, Ada Cambridge, Catherine Helen Spence started this way and then made it in the big smoke, in fact, in London. Martin's first verse was a rather jokey one about barrels of whiskey, because her family the women were great temperance advocates. The brothers weren't necessarily so. In fact, one of them was in jail in Mount Gambier for a while because he refused to, demanded that the pub be open when it should have been closed. But this writing started on, and in 1874 she wrote the book, The Explorers and Other Poems, with a long poem about the ill-fated Burke and Wills expedition. So she really took on a large canvas. This 27-year-old young woman had the book published by a Melbourne publisher and included her translations of the German verse and drama by Uhland, Herder, Heinrich Heine, Schiller and Goethe. So as long as this very long narrative poem. But of course, as the time went on, the state school system came on. As you know, well, the state school started in the later 1870s. And these little schools couldn't support so many people. But Catherine also had her ambitions. She moved to Adelaide and sought to support herself by writing a serial story in the local press, and then perhaps more. She was about 31 years old. But of course, nobody, as Catherine Spence said, can really support themselves by the pen in Australia. And she took a job as a correspondence clerk in the education department. Now, this was a favour that Catherine Spence had organised for her. She was the only female, and she kept this position after her marriage to Fred Martin in 1882. So that was pretty unusual for a married woman to still be working in that sort of job. They married at 35 years, which when she was 35, so I sort of feel like that she sort of delayed her marriage somewhat. But I speculate that she delayed her marriage, but perhaps it was because his father was such a terrible bully and didn't want his son to marry her. We don't really know. But still she wrote a bit when she was a clerk. For example, going back to the law, which you people have brought in, and I know Alecia will get into, in 1879 she published a story called Breaking the Law, which was about a fashionable, flighty young girl from Adelaide, from a comfortable family, who helps an old friend who'd made a very unfortunate marriage and married a violent, drunken man and has taken their children away from her. The flighty heroine, and she sort of tells the story in her own sort of funny way, flighty way, steals the children back and gets them reunited with their mother. So those of you, I imagine it was down in somewhere like Halifax Street, Gillis Street, to describe all these little far streets with nasty pubs in them, polluted, and where these poor people lived a mean and brutish life in these little cottages. Now, she called it Breaking the Law, as the father was the legal guardian and the mother had no legal rights to her own children. So after she's stolen the children away and made sure that a friend of hers, a young bloke who sort of got his eye on her, has dispatched them down to the family, the mother in the southeast. Of course, I think she's in the southeast. Then she just goes back to another party and does her hair. Now, Catherine Martin lost the job in 1885 at the education department because she complained about her salary and compared it with the male juniors who were coming on after her, and why wasn't she getting more? And so she got the flick. But in 1888, it's reported, and there are some fragments of letters, by other people, that she went off to Germany, to Freiburg and Dresden to study and write. Fred stayed at home. So here she is, a young married woman, getting on. But I'd like to jump a few years ahead in 1890, and her most renowned novel, An Australian Girl, came out. The critic Patchett Martin noted the wide recognition this clever novel is now receiving in the high social and literary circles of London. So I hope you're sort of following me here. It was set in South Australia, in Victorian Germany, in the East End of London. The heroine, Stella Courtland, is quite a girl, the younger daughter of a widowed mother, and unlike her sister, she has no intention of marrying, and she read deep religious and philosophical works, as well as flirting quite outrageously with a wealthy young squatter who was desperate to marry her, had known her since childhood, but whom she knew was rather shallow and only interested in racehorses and betting. She rejected his proposal on many occasions, although once she did say yes, but the next day she said no, which didn't make Ted terribly happy. But just a flavour of this complicated heroine, Stella Courtland, from the novel Australian Girl. The heroine can playfully say, and she refers here to the German philosopher of the later 18th century who was one of the stars of the German Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. She says, I know Kant too very well, and it is a great consolation, for when the hairdresser comes to dress my hair for a ball, I pass the time by remembering bits out of the Critique of Pure Reason. So she's remembering philosophical text. It's sort of like some people having their hair done would be thinking about Derrida. Anyway, the well-known literary critic, feminist literary critic Susan Sheridan, and my dear friend and former supervisor, referred to Catherine Martin as a major intellect of her time. She certainly, jumping ahead a bit more, travelled extensively, often with Fred, who was also a writer, and I don't want to be mean, but a rather boring writer. He loved statistics and figures, for example, about the cost of living for the poor in the European countries he visited, or the social insurance scheme that Bismarck, for example, had developed in Germany. In one of the few letters we have from her on her travels, she joked about how she was sitting there writing and he was poring happily over the most boring statistical volume you'd ever seen. And he wrote a series in the local papers, the Melbourne Age actually, or I think it was the Age, called, I've only gone for 10 minutes, haven't I, so far? Called Life and Labour in Other Lands. I mean, he actually attended the Second International, so the sort of Socialist Communist International in Belgium or somewhere. That's just so fascinating what he wrote about that. But I could talk a lot about her later works, her life, more verse she wrote, the serial stories, another 3-volume novel, sort of detective novel set partly up past Peterborough in a mine, a philosophical work which I must say I don't really understand, but also her last published book was a story about a stolen Aboriginal lad, you know, like about 16, and how his 15, how his mother and her friend went and got him back from a bad white man. So these 2 Aboriginal women are the characters, and they've got different personalities. This was called The Incredible Journey. It was published in 1923 and predated Coonadoo in that it had an Aboriginal woman sort of sympathetically realised, I hate that word, as the main character. I have traced her publications over 58 years from 1865 to 1923. But I think you thought I was never going to get there. But the big questions for me was, how does a Scottish crofter girl become an intellectual in a 19th century provincial South Australian town, Mount Gambier, or even the smaller, more isolated Naracoorte? Now I have to confess that only this week did I read something really properly. Someone wrote criticising me, my work, to say that in a sort of way, they said they were crofters, but they'd been reduced to being crofters, but they hadn't always been these crofters, these poor people who just had a small little bit of land and were trying to feed a huge family. And they were in the way of the capitalist sheep farmers. Another question I asked was, how can one write about the intellectual development of a woman who leaves very few letters, diaries or reminiscences? How can you write about a woman who used many different pseudonyms? Only her last book bore her name, The Incredible Journey, bore her name Catherine Martin. She used Mrs. Alec MacLeod or Anonymous. She used Antalo, the initials CM or the initials MC. Helen Derwent she used too. Or, most annoyingly, but sometimes quite usefully, by the author of, you know, a previous story. So it was like a jigsaw going through the paper. And I have to tell you, this was all pre-Trove. This was when you sat in the funny old reading room the newspaper reading room under the old Institute building where Bert and Fred, who ran the place, were making tea and chatting to each other. And you were going through page by page. But I'll get to going through page by page more later. And perhaps we ought to have a photograph of her. Sorry about that. There's only 2 photographs extant of her. She's standing there, and her widowed sister, Flora Bethune, who, of course, married a drunk, is there in front. And, of course, she's got her widow's cap in, so it's after the husband died. But anyway, and then maybe you better see the next one, just to give you a flavour. Here she is dressed, and you can see Roma. She was in Rome, and she was having an audience, not a personal audience with the Pope, but she was going to when the Pope would air himself and people could walk and look at him. She wrote about that. And so she's dressed to the nines, and I don't know who was the woman that she knew in Rome, but I've forgotten who she's, but a sort of inkling, but she's dressed to go do that, because she was fascinated by Catholicism. Anyway, these are my problems, the question. So in 1960s, Max Harris, the Adelaide writer and critic, wrote an article and called her the most shadowy figure of Australian literature. So what can I do, Kiera, but go to speculative biography? I go back to Mount Gambier. I'd visited there quite a lot as a teenager when my sister was married and living there, and I felt it was extremely boring. But I started looking through the newspaper, as I said, trove, page by page, and I started to see ads for the ladies' school. This is how I found out all this stuff, which I've already told you. A few letters to the press, one she wrote with her brother, I later found, on railways. Then about the bushman's hut, how we should have a bushman's hut. And this was a philanthropic thing. If you know Whitmore Square in Adelaide, the Salvation Army hostel, that red brick one, the governor's wife and other ladies raised money because when the bushman came in, he had all his money, he got drunk as a lord and taken down by the publicans and had nothing. So it was a decent place for him to stay. And also, I said, the first verse was about the problems. I think I told you about the barrels of whiskey, right? But I just sort of wondered, how come she knows all this German? There was some evidence in the newspapers of the German immigrants living in the town and farms. And then as I went through, this newspaper put everything in there. Well, a lot of things in there. They put on plays in German by great authors, also operas, and the only one I've just got the example of now is Nabucco, which of course is by Italian. The Deutsch Liedertafel, or singers, were a very important part of the town. German choirs and singers singing, of course, some of them, the beautiful Lieder of Schubert, based on Goethe's Faust story. She was fascinated by that story. But maybe only when I trudged through the wet grass in the Mount Gambier cemetery one winter day with 2 restless children and an impatient husband, and saw all the German headstones in German, I came to get an understanding of the sizable German community there. I was wondering how this young woman who had not gone to school, who was taught by her mother, who taught her all the moralising, sermonising Christian works of the day, and maybe taught by other relatives in spare moments, and was largely self-educated, could have become so learned and sophisticated and have what I felt was quite a large imagination. Indeed, I wondered what Katie might have learnt in Mount Gambier. I came up with the idea that Mount Gambier was actually quite a cosmopolitan place in her youth. And I worried, I think people thought I, had been on something, but anyway. After all the people there, the adults, had pretty well grown up in another culture. They had learnt other customs, languages and ways. There were a number of Germans. Dr. Weil, for example, was been a doctor in Germany. He was married, his wife had married in South Australia, was one of the sisters of Ferdinand von Muller. Ferdinand von Muller, basically later Baron von Muller. He was ennobled because he was a great botanist. He was the director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens before he fell out with everybody, but he was renowned internationally in Kew Gardens, everything. And another sister lived there too, and she married a Mr. Doughty, who was obviously not German. There were people from the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands. There were Irish Catholics, and there were the English. But English aren't all one group, because you mentioned the Cornish. Perhaps not so much Martin, but others talked about the Cornish almost as if they were savage, the English writers, English people, because they weren't used to meeting them. The Reverend Don, in a talk in 1871, said in their community there were natives of 4 or 5 kingdoms. They were all lumped together in Mount Gambier. Numbers of them were well educated, brought their books with them and everything. Now, of course, Reverend Don wasn't thinking about the Boandic people. But of course, by the mid-1860s, the Boandic had been dispossessed by the settlers. There was a limited discussion of the morality of this and their ensuing misery. And the local interpreter, white man, reproduced some of their stories in the press, as did his mother, the missionary Mrs. Christina Smith. She recorded Aboriginal ancient histories and traditions. And there was also this great plethora of religions. People would like to go down and listen to different sermons. That was your Sunday night entertainment, or read about them in the paper. And when I saw, she was very interested in Catholicism, but when I saw that the local Catholic priest, the Reverend Dean Fitzgibbon, had died, he, in his obituary, had mentioned he'd studied for many, many years in Rome. And I started to see, when he died, she wrote a long poem about him. This is pretty cheeky. A Protestant girl writing about a Catholic priest and speaking, writing and eulogising him. And I started to think, speculation, that maybe she learnt Italian from him, and perhaps it was with him she worked through the large volume of Horace's verse. So there were many avenues in Mount Gambier for learning, from the people around her, the local press, the bookshop, the library and the Institute Library was the central cultural institution, with books, periodical articles and newspapers in French, English, Italian and German, dramatic performances, operas and lectures. But I just have to tell you this, and I'll stop in a minute. This is one of my lovely things when you're in the archives and you want to scream out, Eureka. After the First World War, where Germans were terribly treated and their names would change and the towns would change, she had noticed that in the war in Mount Gambier, because she was living back there with her sister, that the German books that she loved had been thrown out, put in the back room and then thrown out. So at the end of the war, she bravely stood up when everybody was grieving for the people lost in the war and said, "What happened to these?" And she said, "These books had a great impact on me." She remembered a time in Mount Gambier where some of the friends to be valued as long as life endures were Germans, who fostered an intimacy with all that was best in the immortal literature of their country. And so she listed all the great writers. And I will just take your patience one more time to say you can see that there's quite a feminist turn in her life and in her writing. She perhaps too, like her heroine, was Stella, very distrustful of marriage. She wanted to forge her own career. She read George Eliot and I think modelled her writing on her, but also on the German writer Bettina von Arnim. All around her, she saw women not being recognised, violence against women, including against her sister Flora, who'd married a drinker. In 1875, a young German servant girl in Mount Gambier was murdered, and community concerns overflowed, and the Mount Gambier ladies raised £100 for a memorial. So I'm afraid to say that I might stop there, but I will just say something about the incredible journey, the book about the Aboriginal people, that it was said, her incredible journey, because she centres it on the woman, is it Iliapa, who's lost her son to a bad white man. So this is one child to one bad white man, not a whole system that she's talking about. But she puts black motherhood on the same level as white motherhood. She certainly sees Aboriginal women held back by Aboriginal men, particularly the elders, whom she characterised almost as witch doctors, superstitious. But the point is, even in 1923, this was seen as too favourable a view of Aboriginal people. It's a really tame book. So I just want to say, perhaps 1923, 2023, we might reflect upon this as we think about the voice and the importance of voting yes on the 14th of October. So that was a big segue.
Aren't we lucky to be hearing these stories? You know, so far we've learned about the Cornish and Munter, the Scots, the Crofters, and in that process we've also seen through these lives into life itself, other regional communities throughout South Australia. So we're picking up through these women's stories so many other social, cultural, political, literary, legal histories. It's my great delight, in our last speaker, we're going to hear more about the ambivalence towards marriage, and which has been a theme, I think, across our three speakers thus far. What a delight it is to have Alecia with us tonight. She's a dear friend of mine and a colleague of, I guess almost 10 years. Alecia is also an interdisciplinary scholar of law and history. Her book's coming out this year, and so we're going to be among the first to get to hear it before it comes out in November. She's published in national and international journals on relationships between intimacy, imperialism, gender, race, law in Australia and the Pacific. She's a chief investigator on an ARC discovery project entitled Women's Century on Struggle, Juries, Justice and Citizenship. And that she's also the current recipient of a grant of the Francis Forbes Society, which will enable her to research how defamation actions were used in early 20th century to protest race-based harms. Alecia's first book, Wild Man, which is a cracking story, a true story of the police killing mental illness and the law, won the 2016 Davitt Prize for Best Crime Non-Fiction. And she also writes in the popular press for Fairfax, Digital, Inside Story and the ABR. But this new book, which we're going to hear about tonight, will be among the first to hear it. It's going to be launched in November with La Trobe University Press and Blank Ink. And it's entitled... You're just so lucky to be hearing about this from the author herself, Courting an Intimate History of Love and Law. Give it to Alecia, please.
Thank you, Kiera. That is quite an introduction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna people upon whose unceded lands we are meeting, and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose unceded lands this research was conducted and written. And I'd also like to thank the organisers, Kiera and Susan, for inviting me to speak at this wonderful event tonight. So I'm going to begin this speech with a story that establishes the wider sort of Australian context for breach of promise of marriage that I'm going to be speaking about, and then move after that specifically into the South Australian context. Okay, so on a near-perfect autumn morning in Sydney, March 1914, Beatrice Story, a barmaid, sued Frederick Chapman, a farmer, for abandoning her on the day of their wedding. To be precise, she claimed £1,000 damages in the New South Wales Supreme Court for breach of promise of marriage, a suit that could be used to claim compensation for injuries arising from a broken engagement. The very first breach of promise action in Australia was in 1806. The last one was around 1976 when the action was abolished. It has its origins in the ecclesiastic courts back in the medieval period. Okay, back to Beatrice though. So Beatrice had first glimpsed Frederick 1 year earlier from behind the bar at the Captain Cook Hotel. Cavalier, stocky and a spinner of yarns, he breezed into the pub, smelling of horses and flashing his winnings. If I do that, then it's a quote. He told her that he had been at the Morgue Park races down the road. He also said that he was 40, wealthy and a widower. After a month of giddy infatuation, he presented her with a wedding ring and vowed that he would marry her. Almost none of what he told her was true. Beatrice explained from the witness box to the judge and a jury of 4 that she was 30 years old when she had quit her employment at Frederick's insistence and moved back home with her mother, a few doors down on Flinders Street. Yes, she and Frederick had made wedding arrangements at St Barnabas' Church on George Street, she said. 40 invitations were sent out, the wedding cake and the carriage were ordered. She'd selected furniture for their new home in Kensington, and he'd promised to settle the property upon her, as well as gifting her £2,000 to furnish the house. He said that he had plenty of money, she informed the court. In fact, money to burn. The day before the wedding, Frederick kissed Beatrice goodbye on the porch of her brother's house and told her not to be late for church. Frederick never showed up for his wedding. He phoned Beatrice and apologised, asking her to cancel the ceremony as he had just received news that his wife was alive. The marriage, he said, would make him a bigamist. Beatrice was livid, and that's one of Frederick's letters that he wrote her in this period. Frederick rushed to her house and tried to console her, begging her to take the wedding ring, fumbling his way into an embrace, chaotically trying to kiss her. She pushed him away. In the following weeks, Frederick turned to ink and paper, bewailing the maddening effects of passion, confessing that the reports of his wife were in fact a yarn, and exhorting that it was his greatest wish to marry. Beatrice converted Frederick's love letters into legal evidence and his passion into proof in one of the most lucrative breach of promise actions in her decade. £350 compensation for her lacerated feelings. And lacerated feelings was actually the legal category of damages that you would sue under for breach of promise. You'd claim for your lacerated feelings. The next time Beatrice and Frederick appear on the historical record is on the 23rd of January 1915 at St Martin's Anglican Church in Kensington. This time, Frederick showed up for his wedding. A little under 60 years later, in 1973, a grandson of Beatrice and Frederick was also threatened with a breach of promise suit and in fact sued, 3 years before the action was abolished. No newspaper bothered to report it, and in fact we only know of the action because in 1986 a Liberal member of Parliament raised it in federal Parliament. Paul had a girl called Christine, he hissed. Later that day, the Labor MP held a press conference and asked that the remarks be erased from the official Hansard minutes. This Labor MP, the grandson of Beatrice and Frederick, was the future Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating. So, it's a great story. Why would Paul Keating care so much about a past breach of promise of marriage suit? An action which by the 1970s was seen as a kind of quirky relic of the Victorian era. And why should we care about his court case or any action over thwarted romance in the past? What can these minor tragedies that we see in breach of promise cases tell us about the history of love and about relations between the sexes in Australia? And what might they suggest about the extraordinary agency of very ordinary women in the past like Beatrice Story? So these are just some of the questions that I answer in my forthcoming book that's coming out in November 7th. That is an exhausted sigh. And in this book, I use litigants' life stories. So as you can see there, it's kind of divided into chapters that are all based around a biography. So I go into the litigants themselves and use a bit of speculation, historically informed speculation, to tell this history of love. And to look specifically at the way in which love and law was separated over the arc of 2 centuries. So the very last case is in the 1930s, but the action kind of dies around the 1950s and then is abolished in the 1970s. But today I want to bring out the specific ways in which South Australian women use the suit. And it's something that I go into in an academic article that sadly got chopped from the book. It was one of those moments of, that you can't put everything in. So you guys are just getting that. And it is curious how South Australian women use the suit. It was very unique. And in particular, the 19th century meaning of the word chastity, which was crucial to breach of promise of marriage actions. So I'm going to do this through turning to another one of the delights of researching this is that, you go to the newspaper articles, of course, and then you go to the actual archives themselves. And in the archives, you find the originals of all the love letters. Anything that was ever submitted into evidence for court rocks up is there in the actual archives. So they're lovely. You sort of untie this pink ribbon and out comes the usual writs, the summonses, the pleas. And then there's usually a big packet of all of the original love letters from these working class litigants. There's also very unusual things that you can find in there. I found lace that was once submitted, train tickets, receipts from rings, the entire list of a woman's trousseau. They're quite salacious. Okay, so with the South Australian case, I want to look at this one called Bellinger and MacDonald. So, Miss Bellinger, like Beatrice Story, was a woman who knew her own value and was willing to fight for it in court. She was in her late 20s and had been working as a teacher in Echuca, Victoria, when she first met Mr. MacDonald, a wealthy grazier from Millicent in South Australia. According to Mr. MacDonald's own defence counsel, they were an oddly matched pair. Miss Bellinger, he said, and I quote, was young, beautiful, accomplished and of considerable parts, while Mr. MacDonald was an ugly mug swain, drunk, uneducated and of no parts. Yet love, as we all know, is blind. And when the two first met at Miss Bellinger's brother's house in Millicent during a hot January summer, they fell in love. From the time of meeting, the defendant paid the plaintiff very great and marked attention, explained Bellinger's counsel. They went walking together, canoodled on her brother's couch, and he promised her a piano, a trip to England, a trip to Tasmania, and eventually marriage. According to Miss Bellinger's testimony, when he asked to marry her and go to Gillop Station, which is where he lived around Millicent, she replied that she would have to go to Melbourne first. She said, "I've got business there. And it'd not be very nice to leave so soon afterwards to go back to Melbourne, so soon after they were married. So they agreed that they would get married when she came back. So when she arrives back in Millicent a month later, he's nowhere to be seen. She sends him a letter, and finally he appears 2 days later. In the letter, I told him I was surprised he did not visit me, she said. If he did not come at once, I should go to Adelaide. He eventually came and apologised, and they made it up. She even helped to take some splinters out from his hand, she said. Sarah told the court that upon parting, he said, "I'll not disappoint you." And I never saw him again. After which, Sarah fired off a volley of furious letters, which the court read aloud and the newspaper published in full. So that was the other thing, is all the love letters get read out. They then get published in the newspapers. And a lot of the breach of promise cases end up published in international newspapers as well. They're circulating around the empire. So we get all of Britain's cases and, they get ours. So hers probably also ended up somewhere in Hong Kong and South Africa and Britain. Anyway, so she says in these... Sir, she wrote, "Your conduct to me since my return is ungentlemanly. If you don't wish me to remain, why not say so? Not keep me in this suspense. I don't think I could leave without an explanation from you. You had no right to put me to so much expense and trouble and to treat me like this. If I were like many other poor girls without means to convey them to another part of the globe, I'd be left in a fine fix. I have my own livelihood to get, and it's as precious as yours." And what she meant by being transported to the other part of the globe is that she'd been working in Echuca and she was en route to New Zealand to work as a governess. She was just stopping off to visit her brother in Millicent at the time. When he responded that he had in fact never promised marriage, she retorted, "Dear Mr. MacDonald, I can assure you I was surprised beyond measure when I perused your letter of the 7th instant. How could you concoct such a vile fabrication of me? However, as you have gone so far, unless you come here and pay my expenses and loss of time you've put me to in 1 week from the time that you get this, I'm going to bring an action against you in Adelaide. I've been given to understand that I can claim at least £500 or £600, so please yourself. And don't fear facing me for it would be impossible for you to insult me more than you already have. Trusting that you will attend to what I have stated and put me to no further trouble, yours, etc., Sarah Billinger." And then she wrote, "P.S. Every hour that you keep me waiting from now, you'll have to pay for, so you better settle at once." I love her. So, with her brother and sister as witnesses, Sarah had a very strong case against Mr. MacDonald. And the main argument that the defence raised, in fact, they conceded there was a promise, their main argument was that Mr. MacDonald had been justified in breaking it because Sarah was unchaste. So the defence cited a passage from a legal treatise to show that if a woman had been guilty of levity, immodesty, or impropriety in a public place, a man would be justified in breaking a promise to marry her. The defence said that he did not mean to cast any imputations on the actual chastity or purity of the plaintiff. What was meant, he said, was the chastity of her demeanour and conversation. And I quote, "Like Caesar's wife, an engaged woman should not only be virtuous, but above suspicion." In arguing this, the defence were correct. If we turn to the elements of the case, you can see that, basically you've got to prove that there's a promise, it could be express or implied, and that it was a complete defence to prove that there was a lack of chastity. What I found fascinating when I was doing the research is precisely what he explains, that chastity doesn't just mean sexual chastity at this time. And so I found a Western Australian woman in the 1860s who lost her case after she was overheard saying, "Damn it, the ferry is late," while waiting for a ferry. A woman in the 1830s in Tasmania had her damages reduced because, and I quote, "she laughed immoderately in the parlour room." And another West Australian woman in the 1870s was considered to be unchaste because someone once saw her wearing men's pants. But in this instance, the only example of Sarah's unchastity was that she was seen stopping in at Beachport and drinking a glass of port wine and larking. She was also accused of having told everyone at Beachport that Mr. MacDonald was really ugly. But she did assure the court in her testimony that she didn't publish this in the Border Watch newspaper. And that was proven to be correct. So the jury considered Sarah's conduct to actually be appropriate, and she walked out of Mount Gambier Circuit Court, Supreme Court, £300 richer. Okay, which is a lot for that time. That sets you up. So what can Sarah's action tell us about South Australian women in the past? So firstly, On the face of it, you can see that the action enshrined gendered moral norms around women's sexual chastity into law. And as such, to modernise, it looks eye-wateringly sexist, the idea that, that you're justified in breaking your promise if this woman's unchaste. But that's not necessarily always how the action is being used. For instance, she wins. And you can also see the extent to which the action actually empowers Sarah well before she goes to court. She demands compensation for the time that she spent on the courtship when she could have been working. And in a world where marriage was seen to be the only socially acceptable vocation for women, she protests, the importance of her own labour as a teacher. I have my own livelihood, she writes, and it's as precious as yours. They're such powerful words, I think. She also refers to it as a business. So although we associate sort of the early feminist movement with elite women, I think you can see these kind of working women uttering a protean form of, feminist arguments for economic autonomy well in advance of first wave feminism. And like Beatrice Story and like most breach of promise litigants, she wins her case, which also demonstrates the role of the law in advancing early arguments around the economic valuation of care. The fact that she's saying, actually, you're going to compensate me for this time and the amount of time that I've wasted on this. This becomes even more explicit in the cases in the from around the 1890s to the 1930s, women start to explicitly sue on their labours of care. So I found one woman who sued for 10,000 dinners that she had cooked her partner during the course of their courtship, and she wins. The barrister says that they deserve a very high value. There's other women who claim for the domestic labour that they perform during the courtship, and they're all winning. And it's fascinating because I associate that argument with the 1970s housework for wages campaign, or with elite women like Linda Littlejohn, for instance, in the 1930s. She's arguing this. But what I love about this is that it's actually working class women, who are first making that argument, probably because they're used to valuing their own economic labour because they're domestic servants, a lot of the time. So I think that might be why. And finally, and something that I want to pick up on, is that not only was the argument around her unchastity unsuccessful for her, it was also unsuccessful for a range of women who were, by definition, without a doubt, unchaste. And I say this not to be moralistic, but I'm going to show you a series of graphs proving that from my database, that also show, I think, just how peculiar South Australian women are in this. So one of the things that I found curious when I set out to research it was, I had the legal elements there that were like, yes, you're going to lose your case if you're shown to be unchaste. And yet, you have all of these women suing who have illegitimate children. They rock up and they win their cases and are able to prove their chastity with a child on their hip. So it's quite clearly that they're not chaste. And here we have the actual numbers, the status of children in breach of promise cases by state. So look at South Australia, so many more who are suing with illegitimate children. So that's basically single mums are using the action than in any other case, any other state. The other crazy thing is just how many of these actions are being brought in South Australia when you think about the population relative to the other states. It's a much smaller population. The other thing that is interesting is that they're mostly suing in the local court. Okay, so I'll try to give some explanation for this. So unlike every other colony in Australia, as I've said, more women with illegitimate children sued in South Australia than women without children. If we count illegitimate children who died, then it was actually double the number of childless women. Furthermore, more women use the action in South Australia than in any other colony. Almost the same number of women sued in South Australia as in Victoria, a state with almost 5 times the population. So in the 1861 census, Victoria has around 529,000 people. South Australia has 124. So what can explain the litigiousness of South Australian women and the court sympathetic treatment of them? So firstly, there's a technical reason. In 1862, a law was passed allowing actions for breach of promise of marriage to be heard in the local courts. This is not the case in any other place in Australia. As Mr. Waterhouse MP argued at the time, if a female were deceived by some rustic swain, why shouldn't she be able to bring a cheap action to recover damages? And you note that this is happening around the same time as the gold rushes, where men were indeed abandoning women and family life in vast numbers. So what we see, what we in fact see in an action that on the face of it prevents unchaste women from bringing actions is that it's actually being used by single mothers for maintenance, as a maintenance payment, I think. You know, it gives them a lump sum payment. Look at, you know, Sarah Bellinger gets £300, walks out with that. It's so much better than the dribble of, you know, a few pounds a week that you would otherwise get in maintenance, if you're lucky. So, and to my mind, I think the courts are seeking to shift the financial burden of illegitimate children from the public purse or from the church to the men responsible. So a sex labour market made it impossible for women to support themselves and children, and maintenance was unreliable. There was also no common law obligation for a father to support illegitimate children, although each colony did have legislative provisions forcing fathers to pay maintenance for illegitimate children. So if we take South Australia, the law provided two remedies. There was a criminal remedy under the Police Act, said that every person from 1869 to 70, every person leaving his wife or child chargeable to the public without means of support is to be imprisoned with hard labour, you know, for 3 calendar months. So it's quite serious. And the civil remedy is provided in the Destitute Persons Act of but not until 1881, which made either of the parents liable to support an illegitimate child. So it looks okay, there's something there, but in spite of these provisions, single mothers found it very difficult to win maintenance actions. So firstly, establishing paternity was an arduous task. A maternal grandmother's testimony, for instance, was not considered. Obviously, this is a world without DNA, you know, so how do you prove it? And if we know anything from the historical treatment of women in the law, they suffer from what a philosopher, Miranda Fricker, calls epistemic injustice, you know, which is the idea that you are just not believed. And you continue to see it in rape cases today. Secondly, a maintenance order is only enforceable in the colony in which it's made, which meant that men could, with ease, you know, escape their obligations by just slipping across colony borders. And thirdly, proceedings to make fathers liable could be instituted, they couldn't be instituted until after the birth of the child. So according to Shirley Swain, historian, a sample of cases brought before the Magistrates Court in the 1850s showed that only 50% are successful. Okay, so if you compare that to breach of promise cases where almost all of them are successful, it's very rare. I think there was 7, you know, where they lose in New South Wales in the 19th century. You know, it's just a more, it's a better path to go down. And that's partly because the fiction that breach of promise of marriage was exclusively about redressing the loss of a husband meant that establishing paternity was not an essential element of the action. In fact, I didn't find any cases where that was even questioned. And that helps to explain why so many women bring actions and they win. There's also a thing called a writ of capias, which often accompanied the action for breach of promise. And that basically meant that the suitor couldn't abscond. A writ of capias was a writ on your head. And so the minute that you decided to sue someone for breach of promise, you would usually also get out a writ of capias and the police officer would go down and arrest the man. And then you've got the lump sum payment means that, you know, women aren't relying on the goodwill of a man to make weekly payments. So the meagre average of 10 shillings per week, which is awarded for maintenance, can be contrasted to the much more lucrative £100 average of damages for breach of promise of marriage. So when cast in this light, the large number of single mothers using the action seems understandable. For the courts, I think its advantage lay in displacing the financial burden of caring for a child from the community to the fathers. And if we want to go broader than that, we could actually say this is really the beginning of the secularisation of welfare. In Britain, welfare is a parish, you know, and a religious issue. This is the courts actually you know, imposing that. And finally, for our purposes, it shows just how remarkable the ordinary working wonder women of South Australia's past were in claiming legal compensation for intimate harms and expenses. As Sarah Bellinger protested, it was not right that I be treated like this. So where today's Sarah Bellinger might turn to a self-help book, a friend or a therapist, the women of Australia's past marched valiantly into court and demanded money for squandered time and affections. Thank you.
Wasn't that fun? All right, I'm going to put a Ribius corpus? What do I have to do? A writ of Capias. I want to put a writ of Capias on you all. Stay there for a moment longer. We're going to have a Q&A, but before we do that, I think we kind of need to do two things. First, I want you to channel your own Wonder Women. Apparently, when you make the stand, the Wonder Woman stand like this, 3 feet apart, it gets rid of cortisol and it increases endorphin. So I want you all to get up off your feet, up on your bums for a minute, and I want you to do the Wonder Woman pose. And while you're up doing the Wonder Woman pose, to gather your strength and courage, I want you to turn to the person next to you and tell them one interesting thing that you learnt tonight that you never did know before. Okay, that's just to have a break for a quick second. All right, are you all feeling more confident now? I just open the floor quickly to hear what from some people, an answer to that question. What was the most interesting thing that you never did know before that you learnt tonight? Just one or two people who want to tell us, want to share what was really interesting? Come on, you guys. Hand up. Anyone find something interesting that you never did know before? Yes! Thank you very much. We've discovered the Germans of Mount Gambier. Anybody else? Anyone else want to say something new and interesting? Gosh, I learned so much. Yes, Penny. Yeah. Yeah. And we saw that firsthand with Elizabeth, with Lisa's story. All right. So, it's time to get onto the microphones. Okay. We all get a chance on the microphones now. So I hope you had a fantastic time and you learnt a lot and enjoyed it. I thought it was an absolutely cracking session. And, all our talking histories are going to be almost as fabulous, so please come to other ones. But let's just open this up for a bit of a broader discussion. It's a chance for you to ask questions of the panel. One of the themes that's come through is how we write women's stories. I think we're all picking it up and we're all kind of using the word speculation in different ways. I want to talk about some of the problems and benefits of that, because I think there are, because the moment you start using speculation, then you are signalling that perhaps the facts don't have the same stability as, and in so doing you might sort of put your authority as an author on a wobble, on a tentative footing, let's say. So maybe we could start off by just talking with Lainie about this term plausible invention that you're preferring and why that is. And then we can just open up the floor to maybe Margaret after that. You've used the word speculation a few times in your talk. What have you got, Lainie? What are you thinking about plausible invention? What are you saying there?
I certainly didn't want anyone to think my work of fiction was a biography. It's in the end, I've actually gone with inspired by a true story as opposed to based on a true story. She's called Kate Cox throughout the story, but I'm very wary of there being any sort of thought in another 100 years or something that my work of fiction is her true story, because it's not. And that's why I think it's more honest to say plausible invention, even though I've used a lot of speculative biography methods. And I've tried to base it as much on fact as possible, but it still is fiction, and I want people to be really clear about that. But you're so right about, maybe putting your own authorial credibility on a wobble, and that's why I think as a writer, writing about someone real, you should never write what you can't defend, even if it's a throwaway line, on page 700. You've got to be able to defend everything. And your own personal integrity is what does her justice. Yeah.
So we're writing in a style that's drawing very deeply. It's kind of anchored in a bedrock of archives. You're listening to their voices and bringing them to life. But in your case, you're creating an entirely fictional narrative to tell a story, to reveal character, and you're creating fictional figures as well to do that.
Yes, and I want people, because I want people to feel emotionally connected to this woman who is so unlike we are today. You know, she was aloof, she was strict, she was highly moralistic. You know, she'd have a crack at these two for being too close, you know. So I want people to, you know, and I mean, luckily, since Sherlock Holmes, we have fallen in love with quirky, idiosyncratic sleuths. So I'm lucky in that respect, and I'm also lucky that in real life she had a wry sense of humour, because that does endear us to her as well. But to wrap everything else around her just lets her shine, lets us see Kate Cox through the eyes of people who loved her and who, you know, thought she was a bloody old wowser.
Yep.
So, yeah.
And Leeza, you've also used fictional techniques. You've written plays, film scripts. You know, what happens to Elizabeth and your authority as an author in when you're using fictional techniques to bring Elizabeth to life?
Good question. In writing theatre and plays and the films, I use as much as the information that's been given. I've researched and researched and researched as much information as I can. And then there is that little bit of speculative biography. You've got to add a little bit here and there to add that little bit of colour. My dad has done that as well with his 2 books. And the one thing I have found is a lot of people think that is absolutely fact. And there's a lot of people copying that speculative biography. So
that's it. It's starting to sound like AI, isn't it? The way that AI can generate all these language data systems and reproduce them. Yeah, I did want to talk to you, Margaret, because you're dealing with a woman who wrote fiction, and that seems to lend itself. And in the approach that you were talking about, you really laid out many of your speculations. So where are you thinking? Where's your thinking with this?
Well, I think that's very important.
I think it should be on.
Hello? Sorry about the swearing. I was thinking about this. Very interesting, because when I first started looking at literature, you had that sort of very common sense view that the writing, there is a view that all writing is autobiography, and I think there's something very important about that. Even the work I'm currently doing on India, and I've done previously on Indians living in Australia under the White Australia policy, and still currently doing it, I suppose. But how do I read Catherine Martin's writing? Can I read that for information about her own life? And I have done that sometimes. Of course, there's so many different points of view in this novel. There's the Ted, the hero, who likes a drink and a wager and a horse, and he's very physical and earthy. And Stella likes that about him. He's an Australian like her, but she's an intellectual. I won't tell you what happens in that romance. Spoil the end. But for example, in one of the things, the story, serial stories, Bohemian Born, she has a heroine called Guard who talks about learning from her mother or a motherly figure, the works that they learnt, what was, the sort of moralising texts and so forth that she learnt. She doesn't actually denigrate it, but she just sort of says it. And then later on in the novel, the character says, of course, then a family friend brought in the novels by Dickens, and I think Tennyson, but Dickens, and we really start to see another world, And also when her brother Alec dies in the terrible, it was like the crash of a plane, but it's the wreck of the Gothenburg, this boat that was bringing a lot of people down from Darwin down to the southern ports in Adelaide. Of course, lots of the people up there were from South Australia. Her brother was drowned on that. And she wrote a whole serial about that. And she did it around Tennyson, the laureate poet's long poem, In Memoriam, about his friend who died in the... that just permeated the whole thing. And she talked about someone being lost for all time, which was also about she was lost religiously because she'd lost her faith. Her brother Alec was a bit of a prig and very Christian, and was disapproving of her, particularly because she liked George Eliot, who, as you know, lived in sin with a married man.
And trousers a lot of the time too.
Oh, too, really? Not George Sand.
Sorry,
George Eliot.
wrong trousers.
Wrong country. And
Yeah, wrong George.
She didn't marry him, I think, even when his wife died. But anyway, and so I read a lot of her feelings, and the despair, the breakdown I think she must have had after Alec died through that, and that's speculation.
Absolutely. And yet you're drawing on different fictional works that she's done, and in a sense she was breathing her emotional life into those fictional stories.
I think probably the novel or the serial story, I forget now what it was called now, I can't remember it, but I wrote a whole chapter or paper on it, was her way of therapy, working her way through it, and being able to go on and realise, he was a bit down on her in just little snippets, like that Miss Elliot is a little miss, he says, meaning, she's a bit loose, a bit unchaste, or whatever the word was, and he was worried about where she was going with her religious ideas. And so when he died, maybe she felt, because she'd been raised as a good free church Presbyterian, this was God's punishment, and she had to work her way through that. Wow. That's mine.
Your speculations, yeah. And Alecia, your extraordinary women, they are themselves living kind of the romantic narrative, aren't they? First they're going through the peaks of romantic love and the opportunities of marriage, and then they take it to the court because the narrative hasn't gone the way they want. So they are authors of themselves. They're rewriting their stories or trying to get a new end to their story. So how about you as the writer of these women trying to insist upon their own story endings? Let's talk about you as the writer of those stories. What kind of risks did you want to take? Did you take? Because you're working, you work as a legal historian, so in a bit that's kind of well behaved, right? So
It is very, yes. And I was tempted to write more kind of speculatively and then pulled back, probably because, well, there's a few reasons. Firstly, professionally, to be honest, I'm in the academy and I'm a lawyer. I need some kind of proof and evidence. But also, I think that there is a problem with this, which is how do we imagine our way into the interiority of people in the past while still accepting and arguing, as we do, that they're not just us dressed up in funny clothes, they are very different humans. And if they're not writing explicitly about their emotional states, then how do we, in justice, imagine that without being anachronistic? And I think an interesting example of that at the moment is the debate that's being generated around Anna Funder's book, Wifedom. So in that book, if you guys know it, I've only just started it, it's a doorstopper. But in that, she's trying to imagine, she writes a speculative biography of George Orwell's wife. And, it's very much about her being sort of downtrodden. It's a kind of, it's a really sad story. And she got into a lot of trouble with it by Olivia Laing, another writer, who said at every moment that you didn't know, that Anna Funder didn't know what actually went on in George Orwell's wife's life. Sorry, I can't remember her name. Eileen, thank you. Any moment that she didn't know, she said, you invented it, and you invented it in a way that denied her agency. So you've stripped her of agency again. And I think Anna, in return, responded with, why such a focus on agency? Like, why do we need to have that in order to be able to identify someone as being a good protagonist? Often there's not. And to return to your point about the romantic love thing. Actually, I think one of the interesting thing with looking at working class cases is often there's not a lot of romantic love. Often it's, he came down, he said, would you like to marry me? And I said, well, I'll have a look at your house. And so we went up, we looked at his house, and then I went, all right, tomorrow. This happens over and over again. So it's not, there are some, and I obviously picked out the ones that I like, the juicy narrative, but no, a lot of the time it's, I think as a writer, it's important to respect the radical difference of the past and to situate yourself somewhere between familiarity and strangeness, I guess.
I mean, I would, this is a conversation we've probably had before, but I would argue that in fact women's archives very often do leave us with traces and clues of their interior world. So if they write poetry, if they're producing art, when they're with their letters and their diaries, they often give us an insight. They leave us with traces that I think, as Margaret was saying, even in the fictional account, they feel like clues that are asking for that interior world to be aired. But and Alecia's quote there was Greg Denning, the wonderful Australian historian. Let's not think that the past is simply people walking around in funny clothes who are otherwise exactly like us. But it was also Greg Denning who talks about the idea of representing. In the past, when we're doing the past as historians or biographers, we're not recreating the past, we are doing an act of representation, which is called representing. And I think, the kind of work that we might be doing in some ways sits in that space. Over to you, Margaret.
Well, I'm just trying to get more airtime. But just to say that one of the
You're
other
gonna have to
things
fight
that
for
was
it.
remarkable was a woman called Miss Jean Cook, who was the granddaughter of Catherine Martin's sister, Flora, who married a drunk. I saw her, she had 5 letters, she's just sent them to me in the post where I was working. She had 4 or 5 books that Martin had. After she died, I followed up her heirs. She had no relatives. She left it all to her young neighbour, a woman, because the family had been very nice. There were hundreds of books, and they were so nice. I used to go down and sit in their house when they'd all gone to work and look at them. She did lots of inscriptions on them. They said Catherine Helen Spence wrote in the thing to her. One from Fred to my Liebe, which is love in German. And then in the poems, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems that Spence gave her, one verse was cut out, one sonnet stanza. And of course I hunted that up and it was all my love and this and that. So I imagined that she carried that piece of paper around with her. So there was a few scribbly notebooks for historians of colonialism. There is Alec's diary of his time in the Northern Territory, shooting the blacks, thinking about how this river's going to be called Mackay River, be named after him, but of course he got drowned afterwards, so they didn't last. But anyway, just me taking...
No, I love that, Margaret. I love that example of a gap in the archive that actually leaves a clue and tells a story in itself. We've got a little bit of time for questions from the audience, if anyone has one. If you have, please put up your hand. The microphone will come to you, and because it's being recorded tonight, we'd like to get that recorded on the microphone, please. So would anyone like to ask a question to these fabulous women talking about our Wonder Women? Yes, a question down the front. We'll just wait till the microphone comes.
Thank you. I've got a question about Elizabeth Woolcock. Has anyone asked her if she's going to receive a posthumous pardon?
Good question. My dad and I actually did go to the governor for a posthumous pardon in 2011, and it was declined.
Could you go back to the next government?
I think it would take some more backing than just me and my father. So yeah, I'd love to if someone else would be, if there would be more people supporting it. Yeah. I think there's enough evidence to prove that she's innocent, or at least not guilty. Yeah.
If we have no other questions, we've got a little bit over time, so we might wrap it up then. Look, haven't they been absolutely fabulous? Let's thank our speakers for an outstanding set of stories tonight. Then I'd like to thank you, the audience. I'd like to thank UniSA, of course, who are our event partners in this, and also to Channel 44. This event will come up, it will be aired on Channel 44 sometime in the following weeks. Most of all, I'd like to thank, however, the Wonder Women behind the scenes who make these kind of events possible. And I'm talking about Rebecca and Jacinta from UniSA, and my colleagues at the History Trust, Whitney Boyd, Annalise Abella, and Suze Redman, who just do such brilliant, quiet work. Well, not quiet, they just do brilliant bloody work to make this happen. They're not always quiet. I just want to also remind you that on the 17th of October, so that's Tuesday evening, 6 p.m, same bat place, same bat time, we'll be doing the last Talking History for 2023. Picking up on the Halloween theme, we're going to be exploring uncanny histories. 3 panellists will be engaging with these tantalising yet intangible possibilities. Among them, the fabulous Professor Penny Edmonds, Dr. Jess White from UniSA, and Peter Callaghan, who will be talking about the miraculous worlds inside Mary MacKillop Museum. So please come for that. If you're still hot to find out more about writing women's stories, I'll be doing an in-conversation to do with my book, Wild Love, about Adelaide Ironside on the 14th of November at Dimmicks with the fabulous Penny Edmonds. So put that in your diary as well. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's been great, hasn't it? Let's love the speakers one more time.